The idea that us being the only developed country where this happens routinely, especially in terms of the mass shootings, is somehow a result of the design of the doorways on our school buildings is the definition of insanity, if not the definition of denial.
Hi again, everyone. It's 5 o'clock in New York. The definition of insanity and denial. That is how Transportation Secretary Pete Buttigieg describes the ludicrous one-door solution put forward by some Republicans, looks like Ted Cruz, as the plan to stop the next mass school shooting as they try to avoid dealing with the actual problem in America. The staggering number of guns in the country and the ease with which anyone can purchase them. Just this weekend, at least 17 people were killed and nearly 70 were injured in mass shootings in America. According to the Gun Violence Archive, there were at least 13 mass shootings from Friday to Sunday this weekend, which they classify as an incident where 4 or more people are shot, not including the shooter. The city of Philadelphia was one of those places. The shooting broke out Saturday night on South Street. Hundreds of people were gathered outside. Police say at least 5 guns were fired in an attack they believe was precipitated by a street fight. 2 guns were recovered, and this afternoon, that city confirms police have a person of interest in custody. 3 people died. 12 were wounded in that shooting. Philadelphia's Mayor Jim Kenney tells the New York Times this, quote, "People are afraid to let their kids out of the house." He adds that there was little he could say to reassure frightened or grieving residents. Quote, "Words are hard. Words these days have become somewhat meaningless." Senator Chris Murphy, who leads the bipartisan group of senators working on an agreement to toughen federal gun safety laws, feels the same way, that words are not what we need right now. It is action. Murphy says even some of his colleagues across the aisle agree.
I've never been part of negotiations as serious as these. There are more Republicans at the table talking about changing our gun laws and investing in mental health than at any time since Sandy Hook. As late as last night, we were engaged in conversations about trying to put a package together because I think Republicans realize how scared parents and kids are across this country. I think they realize that the answer to this kind cannot be nothing. That it's frankly a test of democracy. It's a test of the federal government as to whether we can deliver at a moment of just fierce anxiety amongst the American public. So we're closer than ever before. Let's see if we land it.
Republican Senator Pat Toomey, whose bipartisan bill put forward following Sandy Hook that would have required background checks on all commercial gun purchases but did not get enough votes to pass, also voiced some optimism this time around over the weekend.
I certainly can't guarantee any outcome, but it feels to me like we are closer than we've been since I've been in the Senate.
And just in the last hour, the group Students Demand Action held a rally for gun safety in front of the U.S. Capitol, seeking to put even more pressure on elected officials to do something. Murphy was one of the senators in attendance. Signs we may see some progress in Congress to address America's growing gun violence epidemic is where we start the hour with some of our favorite reporters and friends. Miles Taylor is here. He's the former chief of staff at the Department of Homeland Security, also the co-founder and executive director of the Renew America movement. Also joining us, Jason Johnson, politics and journalism professor at Morgan State University, host of A Word with Jason Johnson, the podcast, and MSNBC contributor. And Katty Kay is here, U.S. special correspondent for BBC Studios, as well as an MSNBC contributor. Katty, I remember being on Morning Joe with you. Joe and Mika's coverage after Sandy Hook was extraordinary, and I remember having that feeling that something might happen. Do you feel like this is a moment like that when people are hopeful, but because of that experience of nothing happening after that tragedy, that could befall the U.S. Congress again?
Yeah, listening to Senator Murphy this weekend, the thing that sort of depressed me was when he said that it hasn't felt this hopeful since Sandy Hook, because we know what happened after Sandy Hook, nothing. And is it possible that something small happens? Maybe. Maybe there are enough Republican senators who feel the pressure from their own constituents, but it's going to be small, right? And if you think of what is really needed to tackle the huge number of guns in American society. And I think what we saw over the course of this weekend is that we hear a lot about the school shootings and we hear a lot about the really big shootings like in Buffalo, but most Americans who are killed by gunshot are killed by handguns, and they're often one-offs. And we saw some of that over the course of this weekend. What's needed to get those guns out of harm's way, out of circulation, is a huge package of red flag laws, background checks, assault weapon ban, and even perhaps going further, having to have a license for carrying a weapon, mandatory buybacks as they did in Australia. That's what got guns out of circulation in Australia, was a mandatory buyback from the government. And that's not going to happen. Even Senator Murphy, sounding cautiously optimistic, recognizes that whatever does come out of this, if something comes out of it at all, is going to be small. And whether that small thing could make very much difference in the future, you have to be a little skeptical of.
Let me show you something Coach Kerr said last night about the role that voters play in determining whether something small or not at all, nothing at all, or something that you're talking about happens in the future.
We feel very strongly as a league that it's time for people to take notice and to take part in what should be a nationwide effort to limit the gun violence that's out there. So the idea behind wearing the shirts for both teams is to make people aware that they can contribute to different gun safety, gun violence prevention groups. The biggest thing, I think, is to vote. And if you feel strongly about saving lives and possibly even someone in your own family, get out and vote. And that's the only way to convince the people we need to convince to start implementing gun safety.
Miles Taylor, if the shoe were on the other foot and the Democratic Party were the party for weapons of war being in the hands of mentally unstable people, you and I could imagine the campaign that Republicans would run against Democrats. The shoe is on the other foot. The Republicans are the party for doing nothing, or as Cuddy said, maybe next to nothing. The thing that sits next to nothing is the only thing that's even possible. 100 senators, the only thing on the table is something that sits right next to nothing, something really, really small. If the shoe were on the other foot, the party that stood for doing something next to nothing or nothing about massacres at elementary schools and suggesting that the one-door policy, which is also on the wish list of most wannabe mass school shooters, they would be making this the single issue before voters in November. How do Democrats take a page from those maniacal campaigns, usually run by Republicans, and use it against the party that is for doing nothing about weapons of war in the hands of crazy people?
Well, they'll take a page from Republicans by being relentless because, as you note, Nicole, I mean, we both served in Republican administrations. We served in the Bush administration together, and we know that, if the roles were reversed, we would have gone just berserk against the Democrats on this if it was a public safety issue. The Republican Party prides itself as being allegedly the party of public safety. Yet on this issue, they've fallen completely flat. And as you note, have really done nothing. And right now are close to maybe doing a little something. But that's how Democrats hammer this home, is they've got to be really, really relentless about it. In my time in the GOP, what I realized on this issue is that the strategy was genuinely denial. And we saw that with some leaked memos that have come out since the most recent shooting in Texas that showed that essentially the talking points were to start talking about inflation and not talk about guns, to talk about mental health and not talk about guns. And I remember this being the case after Sandy Hook. Is in the Republican caucus, there was widespread discussion, and it was, don't talk about anything related to guns, just talk about the mental health problem. That's sort of an absurdity. And when denial is your strategy, the result is death. And the only reason we're seeing potential action now, unfortunately, is because people's constituents are dying. So these elected members of Congress are coming to the table because people in their districts are dying, people in their states are dying, and then people who vote for them are scared that it might happen to their children, and that's why they're acting. To me, it's shocking that we've had this decade of inaction since Sandy Hook. We've had dozens and dozens, hundreds and hundreds, thousands and thousands more families grieving because of that GOP strategy. It's very frustrating to watch happen, and I can imagine that the families would be open to holding these members of Congress accountable in these midterm elections if something doesn't happen this summer.
Miles, will your group run ads about Republican? I mean, because here's all the places that Republicans have said are okay to be at risk of a mass shooting: a grocery store in Buffalo, a hospital, a school, an elementary school. So it's okay to be gunned down. I mean, are you going to take this message, sharpen it, and run it against Republicans?
I'm not going to make any commitments to anything specific right now because I certainly don't want to tip off people that we're trying to go after. But I'll tell you this: I've had conversations throughout the day about what messages we need to take to the voters to make sure some of these more extreme members of Congress, especially on the GOP side, who will do nothing, lose their job. And this is definitely one of those issues. In fact, this is one of the top 3 issues that needs to be highlighted in those districts to make sure those people lose their jobs and we actually get people elected to Congress who want to do something. I don't care if they're Democrats or Republicans. On this issue, they just need to be willing to come to the table and actually get something done. And if you look at all the polling that's been done since the shooting in Texas or the shooting in Buffalo, it shows that the American people are largely in alignment on reasonable common sense steps that could be taken that would prevent more people from dying. These are not hollow steps. These are not reforms that would just be messaging bills or just signaling. These are reforms that would actually prevent more families from grieving. So let's just get it done, darn it. And if people won't do it, those members of Congress are too scared. Let's get them out of office. Let's get better people in. So in short, Nicole, yeah, this is going to be a key issue leading into the midterms, and it's going to be something that Democrats and centrists go hammer far-right Republicans on.
And Jason, I guess I asked because the reality right now couldn't be any further from the landscape that Miles describes politically. NBC reported on the GOP lawmaker who had to quit after he was annihilated by his own party for backing gun safety. Let me read some of the reporting. A New York Republican who was endorsed by the National Rifle Association 2 years ago announced Friday he would no longer seek re-election. Congressman Chris Jacobs publicly bucked his party last week when he said he would back an assault weapons ban bill if it came to the House floor for a vote. On Friday, he said that stance cost him his political career in the Republican Party. Quote, "If you stray from a party position, you are annihilated." For the Republicans, it became pretty apparent to me over the last week that that issue is gun control. Any gun control. It's like a mob tactic, Jason.
Yeah, and here's the thing. This is not just about advertising. Although messages are great. Look, hey, if I was running the DNC right now, if I was talking to Jamie, I would say every commercial, I want every cashier, I want people from Tops, I want every grocery store executive that I could get across the country. I'd have members of Noble, a national organization of black law enforcement. I'd have cops, school teachers, every single person in a We Are the World, arm in arm across the commercial saying, we are sick of this and get rid of Ted Cruz, get rid of Abbott. I mean, the victims are so across the board at this point, it's not like you can pick and choose. Who the hell should worry about going into a grocery store and getting shot on a regular basis? But we've had 3 or 4 of those in the last couple of years. But here's the thing, Nicole, because all these things are connected. You can tell people to vote. You can say to get rid of this person or that person, but if you don't do anything about voting rights, they can't vote out the terrible people who are keeping these policies in place. That is why the same arguments that activists and organizers have been talking about for the last year and a half matter. Because when you get issues that are of importance, where 99% of the public is like, we're scared and we want something done, if they are prevented from expressing their frustration when it comes to getting to the ballot box, then nothing actually changes. So I would be connecting this to voting rights. I would be connecting this to January 6th. I would be saying we need to get rid of the gun-loving terrorists who are trying to kill your grandma at the grocery store. And that's the only thing out of any Democrat's mouth for the next 6 months. Not baby formula, not gas prices. You don't want your grandma dead at the grocery store. And if they can't do that, they don't deserve to win this fall.
I mean, Caddy, it's so blunt. It's so simple. I asked the question on live TV. It's not what you're hearing at a Democrats. Why aren't these blunt messages when the story literally refreshes itself with tragic effect day after day, news cycle after news? We are now a country that wakes up to mass shootings every morning.
Because of the structure of the way things are, right? I mean, partly it's that gun rights groups outspent gun control groups by 5 times in 2021. There's still a lot more. It's what, Lenin knew. You can whip up a minority of the country, and in this case, there is clearly a minority who supports that position, but a minority can be very powerful when it's used and mobilized. And when you have gun rights groups massively outspending gun control groups, that's one of the reasons. Another reason is that you only have 3 Democratic senators elected in states that are red states, and so there just isn't much to play for in the middle of the country. If you want to have more gun safety laws, you're going to have more Democrats elected, and you're going to have more Democrats elected in purple districts and in purple states, and that isn't happening in this country because the country is so divided and because there aren't very many purple districts and purple states to play for. So you have structural problems in American democracy at the moment that make it unrepresentative. On a whole range of issues, but on this issue in particular. And I don't see how you change that.
Well, it's not Caddy's job to see how to change it, but it is the Democratic Party and this White House's job to see how to change it. I mean, in terms of fodder, Jason, the Times is reporting on lives that could have been saved if some of these measures were in place. The Times reports of key gun control proposals now being considered in Congress have been the law since 1999. 4 gunmen younger than 21 would have been blocked from legally buying the rifles they used in mass shootings. 4 others would have been subject to a required background check instead of slipping through a loophole. 10 might have been unable to steal their weapons because of efforts to require or encourage safer gun storage. And 20 might not have been allowed to legally purchase the large capacity magazines that they use to upgrade their guns, helping them kill on average, wait for it, 16 people each. Taken together, those 4 measures might have changed the course of at least 35 mass shootings, a third of such episodes in the United States since the massacre at Columbine in Colorado. Those 35 shootings killed a combined 446 people. I mean, go find those 446 people's families. That's 446 families destroyed, and everyone in their families, all their children, all their parents, all their siblings, everyone in their lives destroyed. That's 446 lives. Worlds that were blown up. Where does this sort of intractability come from with such a salient and fixable crisis like this one, Jason?
Well, it's partially because people who commit these acts aren't held responsible, and the people committing the acts aren't just the people with the guns, but it's the parents who are buying their kids the guns. It's the grandparents who are allowing these guns to be in their homes. It's the weapons manufacturers who sort of glibly, I was looking up, Daniel Defense, Marty Daniels, who has Daniel Defense, and they're possibly getting sued because of Uvalde. These are people who admit casually in reports and podcasts, oh yeah, our gun sales go up every single time there's a mass shooting. We don't want that, but it kind of happens. The people who are responsible for creating the culture of violence that we're in are not being held accountable by law enforcement. They're not being held accountable by elected officials. You can do something about those people. You can punish those people, but we don't have Democratic governors that go after weapons manufacturers the way that Ron DeSantis goes after Disney. We don't have Democratic governors and members of Congress who get as aggressive with gun manufacturers as Republicans do about voting rights. I mean, a lot of this is just force of will. If you decide that you want to be the outspoken Democrat and say, like Beto has done, I want to get rid of these guns, what's the worst thing that's going to happen? That people are going to vote for you, that they're going to appreciate that you're standing up for an issue one way or another. That's where this is very frustrating, not just for the losses, but for the lack of political will to actually get something done. And I'll say this at the end, because this is not going to be the only shooting that we have. When you hear the ridiculous excuses from Republicans, when you hear them talk about mental health, point out the fact that they're blocking mental health funding. I may be the only person on this panel right now who spends a regular amount of time in a classroom as a college professor. A one-door policy is insane. It is absolutely insane. Every single time you hear a Republican say that, you should bring out just a phalanx of school teachers saying, do you know how crazy it is to get 5th graders in and out for bathroom time, let alone a mass shooter, if there's only one door? That should be the response. But instead, you have people say, we've got to negotiate in good faith, instead of going big and loud and bold and saying, we're going to smack them upside the head with this violence every single time until we get something passed that actually matters. That's what has to be done. And unfortunately, no one seems to have the will to try it.
Well, bold is your brand, Jason Johnson, and thank you so much for bringing it here. Jason and Caddy, thank you so much for starting us off.